Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face, and they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future and the world. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is Jessie Henshaw. Jessie is a physicist and an architect and a systems design thinker. That means that she spent her life dedicated to understanding how natural systems work. And of course, like anyone in her field, she is extremely concerned about where the world is going, really. Jessie worked with the UN to rectify their sustainability development goals and explains why they were false to begin with. Essentially, she's trying to understand how the crisis has been designed and the contradictions which may hold the key to getting through it. This is a pretty wide-ranging and even metaphorical conversation. I really enjoy how Jessie perceives things, looking at the nuance of a situation and essentially revealing how multiple things can be true at the same time and how we need to expand our imaginations in order to best deal with the multiple situations that we face and how they interlock. So I hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, share it far and wide. If you love the episode, do consider supporting Planet Critical on Patreon, where interview transcripts are available for patrons. The link is in the description box below, and a big thank you to everyone who's already supporting the project. I'm so happy to finally have you on the show. I feel like I already know you a little bit because we go back and forth on Twitter so much.
Yeah, well, it's so nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you too. Thank you for making the time for Planet Critical. And I'm sure the listeners really, really appreciate this.
I'm observing that there's an awful lot going on in the world, a lot of changes, pro and con, and that maybe people are beginning to open up to the crisis as it becomes more clear. I don't know. I've been looking for a kind of look up moment as opposed to a don't look up moment for some time. I thought it would come in 2020, the year of clear vision, but that didn't happen, but it's coming.
What do you mean 2020 was the year of clear vision?
Well, 2020 is the measure of optical clarity, 2020 vision.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry. Of course. Sorry, that was obvious.
Right. Well, nothing's very obvious until you look at it from a couple sides. But I'm hoping that we'll be starting to be able to look at the problem through our common aspirations rather than our criticisms, and that should facilitate. My experience began in the 1960s, when lots of people were beginning to notice that the developed world's way of life depended on blindly destroying the earth and resulting societal dysfunction. I developed a current list of things like how complication, overload, and congestion make our systems inflexible and unresponsive, and how growth in the opposite direction requires all of us to change faster and faster. These kinds of physiological contradictions in the system, that is a kind of physics catalog of them that I developed called the Top 100 World Crises Growing with Growth. If you just Google that, it's a long list and pretty complicated, but you get the sense pretty quickly that something is most definitely going wrong. And though science is absolutely a key tool for responding to it, my view is also that the primary cause of the problem is how science and economics analyze their formulas taken out of context, as if they didn't have environments. So their research does not include what is connected to the common motive behind their work, which is to increase our power over nature. So it causes us to be steering blind. And it also keeps us from studying how natural compound growth, or natural growth of new systems, is the start of an environmental process that can be very successful. Natural growth produces all kinds of perfected designs that last for long times. And our lives being one, of course, our bodies did it. Doing the explosive growth part in the womb, organizations do it, um, as well as new popular bands and music styles. They go through an explosive growth process, and then they last for some long time. Um, like jazz, for example, it just has this wonderful history of exploding at first, and then going through all kinds of interesting changes still.
Can we just pause there? Because I think that's such an interesting thought. The idea that our obsession with economic growth or with GDP would actually impinge on other natural growth systems and therefore kind of, I don't know, limit the natural evolution of other systems?
Well, it disrupts their worlds. Just to mention something a little political,
Hmm.
how growth has motivated countries like the U.S., Australia, and Canada to try to erase the indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
Growth wants to have access to all the resources in
Mm.
its way. But I'm really more speaking of how growth is a very successful strategy for building long-term systems if you do it right. And if we learn how to do it right, we might soften the crisis coming for the world community.
Learn how to do growth right. But wouldn't that necessitate then not endless exponential growth, but cyclical, as you said?
Oh, yes. The trick that nature does so casually in many circumstances, and that we find very implausible. It's it's an ABC kind of process that you start with innovation, and then you shift to maturation, and then you have a long life.
Mm.
So it's that maturation process where you take the resources being put into growth, into expansion, and instead put them into perfecting the system and fitting it to its new world. Because growth does many things, but importantly, it's an internal explosion of extraction of resources from its surroundings, and then it needs to switch to living in the world, to adapting to the world, and it's
Mm.
and nature's process is triggered by what we call birth, the shift from exponential growth to asymptotic growth or maturation as the new life gets more and more used to the world it's going to live in. And our intellectual development has blocked our thinking about that. As I mentioned, with how science takes all its science and economics take all their formulas out of context, or largely do. Some of the interesting connections I've had just this week are with Trabian Shorter's Black Lives Matter cultural healer, who makes a really nice case of, he calls it asset framing, of how to focus on people's assets rather than their disabilities as a
Mhm.
way to characterize them, and creating openings in the cultural transformations that we need to make.
Mhm.
And he's not so much focused on the global issue, but it's a very good perception. And then there's a wonderful new article by some leading climate scientists called Scientists Warning on Affluence that finally, after years and years of trying to probe the climate science community, shows that the leading thinkers are beginning to realize that growth is the cause of climate change
Mm.
because it multiplies businesses using fossil fuels. That's the purpose of growth.
Mm.
Um, we actually designed our sustainability strategies to perpetuate the cause of unsustainability.
Let's get into that.
Yeah. Well, but it's one of the kinds of ironies that are worth probing, where it helps you look at the environment of things going completely haywire. And the place where that really happened, or one of the places where that really happened, is in the interpretation of the Brundtland Committee report on sustainability in 87, I think it was, Brundtland, which defines sustainability as living well in the present, not harming the future. And
Okay.
the way the Organization of Economic Development countries, OEDC, interpreted it was that money is not the cause. Money is to be held harmless. We're to blame the resource uses of businesses that they control
Right.
and ignore who pays for them to
Right.
use them.
Right.
So it completely detaches sustainability from growth, and
I see.
I've talked endlessly to other sustainability activists and at the UN, and I spent a good bit of time at the UN in the writing of the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals, and I learned an enormous amount about how activist groups compete with each other over their values and don't look at any systems.
Why do you think that is?
I guess it's because that's how they organize, how they attract adherents is by leading the charge towards certain values.
Mm.
Our whole culture suffers from a lack of understanding of natural systems and how they work. And there's an exception, and that's that there's another one of these ironies, these contradictions between how life makes so much sense at home and at the office, where people have direct nonverbal connection between their relationships and are sensitive to their environments, and the public sphere, where we run the world and by remote control, in a way, by these
Mm.
formulas that we developed disconnected from nature. And
Mm.
that pattern actually goes all the way back to the dawn of science. The dawn of science took pride in squashing what they called natural religion, which was actually a science of home culture
Mm.
that lasted 2,000 years before, was highly developed, was actually the source of Greek architecture and democracy.
Mhm.
But the scientists were so thrilled with their use of mathematics to make a killing in things like the olive market that everybody went for this abstract view of nature
Mm.
as something to control with rules.
I wonder as well if what you're saying about people having a relationship to their workplace and their home environment, and yet
Right.
the public sphere is sort of remote controlled, which I think is just such a fantastic image. I wonder as well what the desecration of the commons did to that as well. Because right now, I think what we're seeing is all these sort of opposition, well, not right now, forever oppositional binaries, which is why in the first 30 seconds, what you were saying about, there can be good growth and cyclical growth, because right now it's growth versus degrowth. And another thing is, private property. People saying private property is a terrible thing. Everything needs to be sort of communal. And yet perhaps there is an element of like ownership or responsibility in property that is commons. It cannot just be commons. It has to have that unique sense of belonging to and being a part of a community. I wonder if that desecration of the commons as well has kind of fed into.
It raises a lot of questions. I think that where I've gone with it is to see that it's our failure to study how natural systems work that has caused everybody to drift into their separate silos of communication.
Mm.
Our human cultures have a hugely important role in our lives. Most people don't notice, but our cultures are really the only possible location where all our ways of understanding and working with the world are stored. And they have marvelous ancient roots and traditions that are sustained over huge long periods of time. So they have a special design for maintaining the integrity of the culture. That's what's going on when you learn the culture from your parents, the root ideas and principles, the ways people respond to each other and respond to the world, and then you build on it in collaboration with others around you, all refining their way of expressing the common culture. Every member of a culture has its own copy, its own authenticated copy, coming from their parents who got their authenticated copy from their parents. And so this large distribution of authenticated copies of the culture that I think is is in effect a blockchain
Mm,
uh, to assure that the culture can't change unless it changes as a whole, that no individual
mm,
can change the culture, that the culture is a unified object of the w- ways of life shared by all its members. That said, we've been multiplying cultures that disagree about everything.
mm.
And science has never studied this kind of thing. Is part of the problem that we've been trained to reduce nature to numbers, and
Mhm.
nature is really organization. And you can't reduce organization to a number. That's what I'm trying to help change, and I endlessly run into resistance. Uh,
Mm. So you think it's gonna demand a cultural shift up the blockchain then in order to tackle the crisis?
Well, I think that the kind of extreme example of how nature solves that problem,
Mm,
because other systems in nature are designed around kinds of blockchains, like our own bodies, where
mhm,
every cell has a copy of the whole.
mhm,
Um, and relates to other cells in relation to their role in the whole. That's the organization of biology at work.
mhm,
And for biology, the solution that nature finally resolved to shift the whole from multiplying its parts to coordinating them and fitting them in with their environments, we call birth, where
mm,
where exhausting the capacities of the womb, you get thrown out to see if you can take care of yourself uh,
mm,
with a little help. So for us, if we if we collapse the environment, there's nobody here to take care of us. Uh,
mhm,
if that's our way of initiating our birth into the real world. It might change our perceptions, in a sense, be good, but we would be left without any capacities. So my hope is that some of this kind of thinking of what we're going to give birth to as we end our exponential growth, it will inspire people and allow their aspirations to change the system as a whole.
So would you say the kind of growth that we are in, due to, well, let's call it capitalism,
Uh-huh.
would you say that then that is sort of constantly stuck at the birth stage, at the innovation stage?
Yes, absolutely. We knock down barriers to growth all the time. We've been doing it again and again. One of the longest debates in economics is whether um, innovation is destructive creation or creative destruction. Uh, the reality is that with the natural limits of the earth, it becomes more and more of the former, the destructive creation. Uh, it's a somewhat of a sliding scale. Destruction of the earth doubles every 30 years approximately.
Mm.
In the last 30 years, the destruction of the Earth in that period equaled the entire destruction of the Earth preceding it,
Yeah.
all the time of the growth system preceding it, because it's successive doubling means that in each doubling period, the system is expanding as much as it expanded throughout its whole past history.
Yeah.
So that is a argument by metaphor, you could call it, but it's also a real pattern that is inherent in compound growth.
Mm.
I was wondering if maybe it would be good to talk about where all this came from in my work.
Definitely.
A bit of it came from retracing the early history of science, as I mentioned, the Great Connection. I grew up in a small college town in New York State and was taught from an early age to look for natural patterns, a favorite thing to do with my dad, a physics professor. And that produced a quite unusual approach eventually to science. Unbeknownst to my dad, he got upset about it later. But my delight was in noticing missing information where I'd see a pattern that I couldn't understand because something was missing. And that came out in first semester freshman physics. We were doing a lab using a strobe light to photograph and digitize the path of a ball thrown in the air, a beautifully smooth parabola in the image, and then to measure that and calculate the formula. While standing around, I made a little joke asking, "What about the tossing and catching?" Those were, of course, not in the picture. Little did I know at that time, but I'd really stepped in it. What makes life lively are just those bursts of energy that develop by unseen means to begin all kinds of singular events. Even today, physics does not study how those spontaneous energy concentrating behaviors, like the tossing that comes about as a cascade of muscular contraction that you can follow somewhat in your own body, but you lose track of where it really began. So the problem is with it that it's an organizational process in the environment, and so there's no data. So science finds it hard to study, would find it hard to study in any event. Some scientists like Robert Rosen and Alan Turing have famously tried. However, those and others generally return to simplifying environmental systems to statistics and totally missing their organization, which is really what's happening. So, as I began to think about it, I also noticed the natural shapes of nature that of soft corners and edges of everything, the smooth gradations of change, how natural systems have many nested scales and layers of environmental relations. Those struck me as very different from abstract equations, and their infinite precision taken out of context. Somehow, natural processes all seem to visibly start and stop smoothly, except, of course, for the ones we can't see. We can't tell how they start and to stop. But the few that you can't see, they start smoothly. So math is quite unlike nature, however useful it is for making machines. But it implied that there was a whole real world that physics does not study. I noticed something was missing from physics.
Mm. Well, because this is the thing. I mean, your career is so fascinating. You've been redefining how physics approaches systems thinking, right?
Right.
And it's from is it from this singular observation when you were younger?
Well, the way growth systems emerge is from a singular connection or insight, the way a snowflake begins with a microscopic crystal on a piece
Mm.
of dust
Mhm.
and and then something about that crystal sets a pattern
Mm.
that then evolves as the snowflake grows, either at the office or home. When we try to build a complex system, an office project or a dinner for 10 on a holiday, it goes through the stages of first an instigating image, an idea, and then other things build onto that evolve the idea over time and take it to a point where you have to cut any excess tasks and focus on getting it on the table at the right time. And so refining the design and perfecting it, and it's in order to complete the design before it's released into the world. And that's what you do in business when you develop a new product. It's got to be right by the time you release it. You can do all sorts of crazy things before, but it's got to be complete and perfect by the time you release it. The finishing steps of a complex design are almost as important as that inspirational beginning. And it's similar with a relationship that you have the inspirational beginning, and then a few days or weeks later you realize this is nothing, or this is something. And then that realization that there's something there to perfect or not takes hold, and you change course. You stop, simply amplifying the responses that you're getting, but living with the person that you met. It's a universal pattern that we deal with all the time. I previously mentioned as an ABC, but it's the burst of creativity and then the coordination with its world and life of service after that, or life of a role in the world.
It makes me think of Nietzsche's concepts of Dionysus and Apollo, the Dionysian creative, passionate energy, and then the Apollonian structure and almost rigidity. And it's those two. It's the marriage of those two energies that can kind of give life to that which lasts.
I haven't heard that before, but it sounds like a part of it. The Greek stories are full of, well, everybody's stories are full of insight. The old stories that are told again and again and again, for some reason, it's because they contain a lot of insight of some sort.
Sure, but I think what's so complicated about what we're now facing is that the it requires such a stretch of the imagination because we're going beyond the concept of like oppositional binaries essentially constantly, right? Like the solutions, the necessary solutions to combat the energy crisis, the economic crisis, the ecological crisis. I mean, they require such nuance, and multiple things can be true at the same time, things that we previously thought only one of which could exist. And I think that's part of the problem. Like, as the intellect and as culture has grown, developed, we've reached such a place of complication that we've almost created a situation that's beyond ourselves, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, we have.
I wonder then, what would a society in its maturation or long life stage look like then? How would you design that?
Well, look at the ones that have have matured. The organizations that grow and sustain their culture, for like the NGOs that famously have a culture. What is the Doctors Without Borders? All the others. I'm not catching the thread of them at the moment, but I don't know. One of the strange examples that I read a wonderful study of a while ago was of Russian scientists perfecting the weaponization of smallpox. they they just related to each other as if it was ordinary business. They just merrily went along, even though they were putting the planet in danger. And this really happened.
Is that an example of maturation?
Well, yeah, that culture matured around a perverse understanding, like capitalism is a culture that matured around a personal perverse understanding. These are not things that we can directly control. It's more possible to inspire. And one of my principles has always been that growth systems and cultural change are not things that you you resist, but things that you guide, that you move them forward in the right direction rather than try to cause them to go in reverse as if they were a vehicle or something. But they're not vehicles, they're evolution. And evolution doesn't go backward unless it gets rather disrupted. And then it's not backward at all, it's just disrupted future.
Does that have to be going backwards? Can it not be a reorganization of the system? I'm thinking of degrowth scholarship.
I'm familiar with degrowth and correspond with some of the people in it, but I hadn't heard of that phrase. I think that's healthy,
Okay.
similar to peer-to-peer or cultural and community and business relationships and
Mm-hmm.
organizations. Is a new evolution of a direction that neither of which is going to get anywhere until we relieve the pressure caused by putting all our money into investing in expanding the system's profits ever faster, um, extracting from the earth. So what we need to do is either collapse the system as soon as possible and reset everybody's rudders all at once, the way
Mm-hmm.
birth does.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how birth works, how it switches a system from exploding to collaborating, uh,
Mm.
is that it switches all its switches at once, and they find that they're trying to fit into the world rather than take it over. I see things like the uh, the anti-vax communities in Europe and America. They don't seem to be elsewhere so much, but
Mm.
I'm wondering what it is that makes people suddenly group together to oppose one of the best services that civilization provides. And I think they're reacting to something definitely being wrong and just connecting with each other on the belief that they're opposing something wrong, and
Mm.
it's really with the system as a whole
Mm-hmm.
that's causing the disruptions and dysfunctions
Mm-hmm.
all over the place that are unfortunately still protecting the system is still protecting the people who manage it and have these delusionary approaches.
Can I just jump in there and give a really good example, actually, of what you're talking about? In Malaysia, the Penang tribe, they're one of the last nomadic tribes in the world. They were refusing the vaccine. And a lot of misinformation is spread through WhatsApp, especially by Western doctors, Western snake oil
Yeah,
salesmen.
that's right.
Yeah. But I covered this from Monga Bay, and I spoke with some Penang people, and they were saying we don't trust the government. We have been abused and exploited for so long. We're not
Right,
saying we'll never get the vaccine, but just leave us alone. We're going to go into the forests. We can fend for ourselves, and it's
right,
exactly that. It was a symptom of how the system is broken. Uh,
right.
in Malaysia as well, the politicians and the elite were getting Pfizer while the rest of the population was getting Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, which was much less effective. So
Uh,
it was very much symptomatic of the fact that the Penang felt intuitively and had seen for so many decades that the system was not built for them, it was built to take from them. And that's how part of their resistance came out, saying, no, we're not going to take the vaccines right now, thank you, because it's not mandatory.
oh, that's very close to the stated rationale of the American far right that government is the problem, and of course, government is partly the problem.
Mm.
And all the scientists are promoting endless growth, but that's the general feeling and the actual problem are different.
Yeah.
Like the very popular financial protest movement, the Occupy Wall Street, that was promoted by some leading thinkers and was certainly energized a large community, didn't understand that protest is not what financial people listen to in making their decisions. It's how they make their decisions based on the numbers that steers the world system. And the basic mechanism of it is to use profits, which are then free to use for anything else, and put those profits into whatever is going to make more profit. And that is what maximizes the growth rate and of businesses producing profits for investors. And to change that, we'd actually need some kind of an investor revolution, not an attack on the people carrying out the investors' instructions, an investor revolution to use. People are familiar with tithing for religious purposes. Well, call saving the earth a religious purpose, and investors tithing their unearned income, the profits, to invest in slowing growth and caring for the damaged planet.
But they need an incentive, which they don't have right now. And that's why I was very excited in when was it January 21?
Uh-huh.
When the Wall Street bets sort of mass protest happened, and those redditors, the people with very little capital, like crashed the
Oh, yeah.
market. Remember that? I was so excited. I was like, right, this is it. This is where we're seeing the kind of protest that meets these people in their paradigm, essentially, as you're saying. These people bet against what was it? I can't remember. Oh, about GameStop. That was it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they tried to tank the stock, Wall Street, and everybody who had an emotional relationship with either that store or with the ideology behind it, that the big man shouldn't get to win every time. I mean, A, people made a fortune, and B, they made capitalists lose a fortune in that week.
Well, but they were the supreme capitalists of the moment, though.
Yeah. But not, yeah, sure.
Well,
But
they were, and
yeah.
they and that this is what's happening with all the ups and downs in the stock market. All of them are these attack strategies of capitalists attacking other capitalists, pumping the market, dumping it, uh,
But they
skimming.
didn't dump these people. They didn't dump. Even when the price was going down, they held on. And that was what made all the capitalists lose a huge amount of money. It was very much a kind of vitriolic rebuttal of playing the game, it seemed. I mean, some people made cash, but most people went through, they made tens of thousands of dollars and then lost them by the end of the week because they'd refused
Right.
to sell, which I just thought was beautiful.
I guess I should reread up on that. But um, what would be an equivalent that would be contagious for investors? I'm not sure. I call it fair money, to have money that it isn't tainted. You need to spend enough of your profits on saving the earth to begin to turn the ship.
Well, I think until you decouple money from politics, there's not going to be much incentive to do that.
Well, also from livelihoods. I mean,
Mm,
I have uh, savings that I'm relying on, and I'm spending as much of my unearned income as I can safely do. But everybody uh, is looking at a longer and longer retirement
mm,
and needing more and more money to float them.
mm,
And there are all sorts of these contradictions lying around.
That's interesting. I want to ask you
Uh-huh.
about these sustainability development goals. You found, because
Yeah.
when you were working with the UN, right, you found that there was a problem with the standard sustainability metrics. How are they being measured, and what's the issue?
There are a variety. Um, And as the implementation of the SDGs has progressed, the the people on the ground may have changed some of the procedures as they find what works.
Mm-hmm.
So what I saw of the beginnings might have changed somewhat, but one of the things that is still a glaring problem is the SDGs are still a growth maximizing plan.
Yeah.
Uh, that's that's SDG 8, and the idea was that the undeveloped countries would grow and everybody else would dial back, uh, and that would leave space for them. And of course, there hasn't been.
Yeah.
In fact, how the economy works is that the most competitive parts of the economy rob the poorest.
Mm.
And that's how the undeveloped countries stay undeveloped.
Mm.
As with any generality, there are exceptions, of course, but there's so many contradictory problems. We have this mass migration uh, problem all over the world, partly because of the counterproductive effect that economics says that increasing competition creates jobs, and it
Mm.
actually shrinks them for the people whose resources are taken.
Yeah.
And of course, then there's the other side of this that I shouldn't ignore, and that's that the resources are worthless without the organization of the
Mm.
people using them. So, things like that competitive disadvantage that the developed world creates for everyone else
Mhm.
wouldn't exist if the developed world wasn't really pretty ingenious in how it uses things.
I want to ask you something. I haven't asked this question yet on the show.
Oh,
Because it's a big one. One of the arguments that I see most often against change and against achieving a homeostasis of planetary life in which ecosystems work together and human beings are part of that ecosystem.
all right.
One of the argument I see most frequently against that being a possibility is
Uh,
that it's not in our nature, that human beings, life itself is incapable of limiting itself, of restraining itself, and that human beings are like or anything, any living being on this planet is like a bacteria, and given the right context, it will just spread itself out over everything. Is that true?
well, there are a lot of different versions of that myth.
Myth? Okay, I like where this is going.
Well, Rachel, all I have to do is point to the fact that we self-limit ourselves in all our relationships.
What do you mean?
At the dinner table, we don't take more than our share. Let's say there's one dish that's really popular,
Hmm,
and we make sure everybody gets enough.
hmm,
But the office, we, we see somebody's having trouble, and we pitch in and help.
hmm,
Similarly, on the street, people take action when there's a need to.
hmm,
Um, so um, those are all homeostasis functions. I think that one of the main reasons people are not aware of how lively homeostasis is because it's represented as a negative feedback, and it forgets that the negative feedback is in response to positive feedback. This is one of those odd things that people get blinded very quickly by theories. Science has arrived at this conclusion that everything is breaking down,
hmm,
that entropy is a constant force, and that's the driving force of change in the world. And well, things have to build up before they break down.
hmm,
And you see that all over the place. Plants grow before they die, and songs begin before they end. And,
hmm,
and in between, there's all sorts of lively stuff.
hmm,
And so not appreciating life is what I I'd see as the maybe the root source of the idea that is sort of forgiving our greed and egotism, the maximum power principle that everything takes all it can all the time, and which is just not true.
Mm.
If you see how people live, if you see how things work, you know, maturing at the end of college and heading off on your own, ready to deal with the world, is not boring.
Mm.
You know, it's not a death sentence.
Yeah, and I think again, I've not studied natural systems, but I've been led to believe there's also examples of this in natural systems, in plant ecosystems and animal ecosystems, that there is a capacity, if you're looking at life with a capital L, and whether it's the natural balance of things which leads to it, um, but what was that somebody said on this show? I mean, life is a miracle because it tends towards self-organization.
Well, it's yeah. I've been mentioning examples of that, the
Mm,
self-organization of of our cultures as they meet new conditions and
mm,
have to uh, share information on how to respond to them in in keeping with the prior culture, but adapting to the new world. And, and cultures, do that all the time. And 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 if you look around, you see eruptive change in cultures too. The how the '60s culture uh, created this tremendous explosion of cultural change that some small parts of lingered on for quite a while and are
mm,
still with us. The cultural equality movements, the LGBT, the really pushing the Black Lives Matter,
mm,
the all these principles of holistic design that are being picked on one at a time by the general community of
mm.
interest in going that direction, and that that has certainly upset the people who were already upset. Um, the religious right was very upset with the hippie movement, and that I think motivated a lot of the the imaginative reinventing of politics that the Republicans did in the U.S. for the last 40 years.
Mm.
But um, uh, all these things are in the mix, and the question is, where are we going? Um, as a group, we're seeming to be inventing more and more problems. Um, and when are we going to reverse that? It will reverse one way or another. Um, will it be inspiration or exasperation? I don't know.
TBC, to be confirmed.
Really compare.
Jesse, what a great funny note to end on. Thank you very much for your time and for all the work that you're doing. Where can people find out more or read some of your work?
Well, the simplest way is to go to my homepage, which is jessiehenshaw.com. JESSIEHENSHAW. And that's a placeholder for a new website of mine, with a bunch of links at the top and at the bottom and a story in the middle.
I'll put links to it on planetcritical.com so people can find you and read all about it. My final question, of course, is who would you like to platform?
Well, I thought of three people. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. Nora Bateson is one, the daughter of Gregory Bateson, who has some wonderful insights, and Michael Bowen, who's the maestro of the P2P movement, has wonderful insights, and also David Snowden, who's um, a more traditionally educated physicist who switched from trying to model complex systems to helping people respond to them.
Interesting.
Yeah. So 3 great people.
Thank you very much. Jessie, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
If you want to learn more about Jessie's work, I've put links to her website in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. A huge thank you to the Planet Critical patrons and supporters who enable me to invest my time every week in this podcast. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.